All right, y'all. Welcome to the show. I'm Scott Horton. I'm the editor of antiwar.com, and I host a radio show called The Scott Horton Show. It's libertarian foreign policy mostly. And this is my show. I'm a co-host sort of thing. This is one of my shows here on the Liberty.me platform, I guess I should say. I do Eye on the Empire with Jeffrey Tucker every other Tuesday. And this is every Thursday. I interview Jacob Hornberger, the founder and the president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. Welcome back to the show, Jacob. How are you?
Always great to be here, Scott. Doing well, thank you.
Very good to have you here. And for people who don't know, let me talk about your foundation for a second. Jacob, he puts out a monthly journal that's called The Future of Freedom, just like this show is called, and just like the foundation is called. And he has a bunch of great writers like Jim Bovard and Richard Ebling and Anthony Gregory and Andy Worthington. And I'm forgetting Wendy McElroy and a bunch of great authors that write in the Future of Freedom. And they've been around since 1989. And the entire archive is there on the website at fff.org. I mean, it is just a real treasure trove of, basically current events, libertarian polemics on current events. But with such historical perspective because of just the quantity and, of course, the quality of what's all there. So please just go to fff.org and dive in. There's tons of stuff there. So check that out. Okay, so now the reason that we're doing the show tonight is we want to talk about the Cold War. And sometimes I think it might be hard for a conservative or libertarian maybe who comes from the right to think of the Cold War as nothing but a sham. I mean, that's some kind of hippie talk. But Jacob Hornberger, he's not a hippie. And he seems to think that the Cold War with the Soviet Union after World War II was absolutely unnecessary, Jacob?
Absolutely. It was really just a great big racket that served as a justification for a fundamental realtering of our federal governmental system. And that is with the national security state, a type of governmental structure that really is inherent to totalitarian regimes. I recently read an article in the New York Times that described China as a national security state. Well, that sort of confirms the point I'm making, that this apparatus that came into existence, consisting of an enormous standing army, Pentagon, CIA, NSA, it fundamentally altered the type of government we have for the worse. And they used the Cold War as a justification for this enormous restructuring of America's governmental system. And then, of course, they not only used the Cold War for that purpose, they provoked crises within the Cold War to justify ever-increasing budgets for what became known as the military-industrial complex. That was the way President Eisenhower later referred to it. And in confirmation of this point that I'm making about how different this was from the vision of government that our founding fathers intended for us, when Eisenhower was leaving office in 1960-61, in his farewell address, he pointed out that this structure, this military-industrial complex that had come into existence at the end of World War II, 1945 or so, more formally in 47, was a different type of structure. He says this is alien to America's way of life. And he pointed out it is a grave threat to our liberties and our democratic processes. And of course, that was the main reason why the framers had rejected this kind of way of life, standing armies, secret police forces, intelligence agencies, because it is the gravest threat to the liberties and freedoms of a people. That's why it's inherent in totalitarian regimes like in Red China.
All right, now, so last week or the week before that, you corrected me when I said, yeah, after World War II, they just never took the military apart again like they always had before. And you said, actually, well, that's not right. There was a year and a half, couple of years in there, a lull sort of between World War II. Obviously, they had millions of men, 16 million men under arms for World War II. So clearly there was some kind of huge demobilization after that. But still, it really waned far before it waxed again. Is that right? I even remember a great interview of George Carlin where he talks about, yeah, man, 1946, what a great year before Harry Truman ruined everything with his evil national security state. But 46, that held all the promise of America, real peacetime and what could have been,
Well, if you look back at the previous wars, like the Civil War or the Mexican War, even World War I, there was always this principle that you build up to fight the war, and then you dismantle the standing army. Now, that doesn't mean that there was no soldiers on duty at all. They had a very minimal force that served as sort of a core element of the federal government's army, that in case an emergency came up, America was attacked or invaded, there'd be a core element that they could build on. But it was very minimal. You certainly couldn't go to Europe and engage in foreign wars with it. That was why in World War I they started drafting people and recruiting people, because they didn't have that kind of army. And by the way, what America learned throughout those years for a century and a quarter or so was that when you don't have this huge apparatus, you actually have a stronger nation. That is that the private sector has more wealth and more productive capabilities, so that if you ever have to go to war, you have much more industrial capacity to convert to wartime uses. Now, in World War II, you're right. The massive army that had been built up, and I don't know what the numbers are, certainly was dismantled to a certain extent. I mean, it had to be. It was a huge army to fight the Nazi machine, but it wasn't downsized like it had been in previous wars. A huge military establishment was left in place. Keep in mind that they built the Pentagon. They started building the Pentagon in the middle of World War II. I think it was like 43, which already indicated to you that this contingency that wanted to fundamentally alter America's way of life on a permanent basis had designs in mind that this was not going to be over once the war was over. And so what they left in place was the Pentagon and an enormous military establishment. In 47, they bring the CIA into existence, which was really just an outgrowth of the OSI in World War II. So World War II really does form the basis for what we call a national security state. In 47, we have the big standing army. We have the makings of foreign military bases. We have the CIA, which, by the way, was intended as strictly an intelligence gathering agency, but somebody slipped in a clause a nebulous type clause that was used ever since as carte blanche to the CIA to do whatever it wanted in the interest of, quote, national security. So you have the national security state formally coming into existence in 1947 with the National Security Act, but clearly the framework of it all was World War II. And then the Soviets, who had previously been America's partner and ally for 4 years or so during the war, are immediately converted in, well, not immediately, but right after the war, are converted into America's World War II official enemy. And the irony of this is that this was Hitler's official enemy. I mean, it was the Soviets that Hitler always intended to go against. He was very anti-communist. He gave the same kind of anti-communist pronouncements that the U.S. would end up giving after the end of World War II. And so America adopts Hitler's official enemy, which had been America's partner and ally in World War II, as the Cold War enemy that was then used as the justification for this fundamental realtering of America's governmental system.
All right, so I want to get back to the fundamental realtering in just a second, but what about that Soviet Union, though? That thing was huge. It's the biggest empire in world history as far as total landmass ruled out of one capital, right, under a totalitarian communist system of, basically abject public slavery for everyone, and with an ideology that says they're saving mankind from the depredations of those who would, save and reinvest and stuff like that. So isn't that what they always said? That's what you always say. They always said, hey, this wasn't just a big old Russian empire. This was a Russian empire, a Soviet communist empire driven by this madman ideology. And, you go back and look at those globes, you just can't deny the size and the strength just of the landmass controlled by the Kremlin. So maybe there really was a threat. You sound like, the Soviet Union, that's like the Canadians. Why would you have to have a Cold War against them? But maybe there's more to it.
Well, let's go back, for example, to World War I. I'll answer your question, but let me put it in some perspective. World War I, America intervenes in World War I really for no reason at all, no good reason. They start drafting people to intervene, and Wilson says, we're going to finally bring an end to European wars. They've been fighting in Europe for centuries, and America's intervention is finally going to make the world safe for democracy, and this is going to be the war to end all wars. Well, it was American intervention that led to the total defeat of Germany. Up to that point, there was a stalemate. It would have probably been a negotiated stalemate. So many people had already died. And but instead of a stalemate, America's intervention pushed the tide to total defeat of Germany. You have this Treaty of Versailles, which was extremely vindictive. Reparations on Germany, the War Guilt Clause. I mean, everybody acknowledged in the post-war years that it was a disaster. That since the Treaty of Versailles was never revised, the conditions of that treaty were used by Hitler to gain power. The resentments that the Germans had to the treaty, he capitalized on that. He gave speeches about it. And so in a perverse sense, you've got this total conquest of Germany that sets the conditions of devastation in Germany that give rise to Hitler. Okay, so we go to war against Hitler and Nazi Germany, but in the process, we make a partnership with the Soviet communists. Now, you and I as libertarians, we stand against communism with every fiber of our being. I mean, we're libertarians. Any collectivism, whether it's Nazism or fascism or communism, we stand against it. I've always made the argument that there was no reason to partner with evil, and the communists were evil. That all you had to do if you were going to intervene in the war against Hitler, and I've always maintained that we would have been much better off not provoking the Japanese, not looking for a backdoor to war, and just stand aside. And Britain would have been better off by letting Germany and the Soviet Union fight it out, because Hitler was always moving east. So, but instead we make this partnership with evil, and in the process of that partnership, and when I say we, I'm talking about the U.S. government, of course. In the process of that partnership, Franklin Roosevelt, the president, agrees to give his partner, the Soviet Union, all of Eastern Europe and effectively half of Germany. That's what Yalta, the Yalta Conference is all about. That was what the Tehran Conference was all about. So now all of a sudden you have, at the end of the war, the Soviet Union controlling all of Eastern Europe, which is precisely why Poland and Czechoslovakia and the rest of the Eastern European countries and the Baltics never considered World War II to be a victory like the U.S. did. Because in their eyes, what's the difference between being under Soviet communist rule and Nazi rule? There wasn't any difference at all as far as they were concerned. And so then what happens is the U.S. national security state, the people in the Pentagon, the OSI, who would later become the CIA, said, look, the Soviets are invaders. They won't get out of Eastern Europe. They won't let them be independent. But they should have known that from the very beginning. When they delivered them into the clutches of the Soviet Union, they should have known that they were never going to vacate those countries. It just was never going to happen. For one thing, the Soviets saw the United States building up West Germany. And bringing it, they were also bringing in Nazis on a secret basis into the U.S. government. They were provoking and stirring up this perpetual crisis against the Soviets. Was there ever any chance that the Soviets were going to, excuse me, come after the United States or invade France? There was never any chance of that. They had lost how many tens of millions of men? I think it was like 29, 30 million people. Their entire country was devastated. They were celebrating the end of the war along with American troops that they met at the Elbe River or so. The last thing they wanted was a fight with the United States, who had proven to be the only country that had nuclear weapons. I mean, why would you want to go to fight against a country that had total industrial capacity, had never had its country bombed or destroyed, that could easily decimate your country? All the stuff, the crises and stuff that the national security state was saying, oh, the Soviets are coming again against us, is absolute nonsense. Now, you raise an interesting question. Could you peacefully coexist with this evil regime? Of course you could. And the way we know that is because we have coexisted with these kind of communist regimes. We coexist today with the Vietnamese regime, a regime that we went to war with and lost 58,000 men. We coexist with China, which is a communist regime, North Korea. I mean, we're not at war with these countries, Cuba. And when the Cold War ended, it proved that you could, formally ended, it proved that you can coexist with these countries. And this is what John Kennedy realized when he was negotiating to end the Cold War much sooner than it ended. So yeah, there was absolutely no reason for America to fundamentally alter its governmental structure or to provoke perpetual crises with the Soviets, because the last thing the Soviets wanted to do was to go to war against the most powerful nation in history, a nation that had nuclear weapons and that showed no reluctance in using them against enemy cities.
All right, now I want to go back to one thing that you said there about not just adopting the Nazis' enemies, but the U.S. government actually adopting a bunch of Nazis after the war and bringing them back to the United States. And I guess it's known, it's pretty famous, I guess, about Werner von Braun, but everybody just says, yeah, well, what the hell? He was building rockets for us, so who cares? But I think there might be a little bit more to it than that. Okay, I've read 2 volumes of Charles Higham. I know there's more to it than that. Why don't you tell him?
Yeah, it's absolutely horrible from a moral standpoint. I mean, here we maintained, the so-called moral high ground in the good war, that we went to war against the Nazi regime, which was evil, and of course it was evil. Now, we libertarians have always maintained that just because there's evil regimes in the world doesn't mean you got to go to war against them. And this was John Quincy Adams' famous message to Congress on the 4th of July in 1821. He says, hey, there's a lot of monsters in the world, but America doesn't go abroad in search of these monsters to destroy. But they maintain this moral high ground. Well, as it turns out, Scott, at the end of the war, the U.S. government, specifically the CIA, starts secretly hiring Nazi officials. And we're not talking about just little minor underlings. We're talking about people that participated in some of the worst deeds of the Hitler regime. And why did they do this? Why were they bringing in Nazis into the U.S. government, paying them with U.S. taxpayer money? Well, because now they were facing the previous Nazi enemy, the Soviet Union. So they said, well, now that we're going to face Hitler's enemy, the Soviet Union, in this Cold War, we now have to bring these Nazis in, high Nazi officials, to serve in the government. Oh, and it's worse than that. They gave them immunity from prosecution at Nuremberg. Now, all this was secret. It's just been revealed recently. At least some of it came out earlier. But, they used national security as the reason for the secrecy. Well, it's even worse than that. It turns out, I just finished reading a book, fantastic book about the germ warfare that the U.S. used in North Korea during the Korean War. It's called This Must Be the Place. It turns out that the Japanese, who, as we all know, attacked at Pearl Harbor, started World War II against the United States in response to the provocations that Roosevelt was doing. They had a massive germ warfare operation. I think it was called like Unit 721, something like that. You can Google it. It's on Wikipedia. Just Google Unit 721. Massive germ warfare, the most gruesome experiments you've ever seen, that they were doing against the Chinese because they were occupying China. And I mean, it's just horrible. I can't even begin to tell you how horrendous what they did to live people with this germ warfare. At the end of World War II, the U.S. gets these people, many of them, and brings them into the government along with the Nazis. It grants them immunity from criminal prosecution, while the Soviets, of all people, are putting these people on trial. They have their own Nuremberg trial for the Unit 721 people that they took into custody. But as far as the Unit 721 people that the U.S. took into custody, they gave them immunity. And guess what? They enlisted their support in developing the U.S. government's own germ warfare over at Fort Detrick. So here the U.S. was, engaged in producing anthrax and bubonic plague and transmitting through fleas and all this stuff. And they got the help of these Japanese war criminals. What happens to your morality that you've always claimed, not you, but I mean that they've always claimed as part of World War II, when you're bringing in the very war criminals that should have been brought to trial?
Yeah. Well, and again, it's funny, I swear all of this, as you tell the story, it all sounds like the Middle East right now. And I can just picture Murray Rothbard and Ralph Raico, whatever old libertarians back then going, yeah, but how did you think it got that way about every single one of these things, where we're propping up the Japanese imperial sock puppet regime in Korea, in the South, and the Korean War against the communists. And why are the communists on the march? Because we just saved them from the Nazis and helped the Russians help Mao. And when we forced the Japanese out of China as part of their unconditional surrender, forced them to leave behind all their heavy equipment and ammunition and everything for the Maoists to get to finish beating off, beating Chiang Kai-shek and pushing him off the mainland there. And so now we have a problem with Mao and communism in China. So now we have a real use for these Japanese war criminals. We can help drop bubonic plague infected fleas over North Korea on Chinese and so-called volunteers and North Korean civilians. And I'm sorry, you read the whole book. Does it say in there the total number of millions of North Koreans that were napalmed and or germ bombed to death in that war, Jacob, by the United States?
It may. I haven't quite finished the book, but my mind never retains numbers. But what you point out is very, very correct. I mean, there is a reason why the North Koreans hate the U.S. government as much as they do. That there was just massive. They essentially carpet bombed the whole country, and I bet a lot of Americans don't realize that they carpet bombed villages and so forth with napalm. And that went far beyond military targets. And I'm sure the attitude was, hey, if we nuclear bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, what's the problem with bombing these communists? After all, they're all communists. That was the mindset. Everybody in North Korea is a communist. So what's the problem with killing them all? And then you've got this germ warfare, which the U.S. to this day denies. But when you read Chaddock's book, This Must Be the Place, you cannot help but reach a conclusion at the end of that book that they did this. I mean, the circumstantial and the direct evidence is so mountainous that really the U.S. is left with essentially one argument, that you can't trust the communists to be telling the truth. But when you look at the testimony of the villagers and the confessions that the American pilots were making and all the other circumstantial evidence, they had an independent international investigation that confirmed that this was going on. I mean, Scott, this is what I've argued about the national security state. And by the way, we're publishing a new ebook in the near future called The Evil of the National Security State. What they did was they destroyed the moral principles of America, on which America was founded. I mean, they upended our entire moral structure, where anything goes now in the name of fighting communism. Anything goes. And so you've got this intervention in Vietnam where you lose 58,000 men under the idea that, oh, if we don't do this, the dominoes will fall and the communists will come and get us. That never happened. The dominoes never fell. That you had assassination attempts against Fidel Castro and terrorist attacks in in Cuba. For what? I mean, they kept telling us this is a dagger in America. This is a danger. Same thing with Nicaragua, Chile, where you had Guatemala, where you had these regime change operations. It didn't matter one bit that these regimes were taken over by communists, that they were controlled by the Soviet Union, because nothing was going to happen to the United States. I mean, today those countries are ruled by leftists. Nothing happens. And this is my point, is that the national security state made everybody afraid. They inculcated this fear that the communists were coming to get us. They went after people in universities here. I mean, we know the McCarthy scare. And my feeling as a libertarian is, look, if you're going to fight communism, and great, I mean, I'm all in favor of fighting communism, but you fight it with ideas, better ideas, libertarian ideas. You don't fight it by going and bombing people and killing people and assassinating people and having germ warfare against people. I mean, this is where the national security state apparatus that fundamentally altered our governmental system also fundamentally altered the moral principles of this country.
Yeah, well, that was what the Senator Vandenberg said to Harry Truman, was go out there and scare the hell out of them, Harry. We got to get Americans on board for this thing, and the only way to do it is just lie your ass off and tell them you're the only thing standing between them and certain death. This is the same program as really all of them to one degree or another. But You know, there's one thing that when I was reading up on your old articles about the Cold War, where you mentioned the hysteria, it's not just the totalitarian bureaucracy on our shores, as William Buckley approvingly called it, that American conservatives were willing to tolerate in order, you know, for the temporary emergency for the Cold War, but the level of fear and paranoia and just absolute ridiculousness about a communist hiding under every bed. And, you know, McCarthy, he wasn't just going after powerful people, you know, where, you know, the Ford Foundation is helping bankroll communists or something like that. They were going after common schlubs all the time, the House Un-American Activities Committee and that kind of thing. And, you know, I've been raised with anecdotes about the real fear that people had of, one, communists everywhere, and two, being called a communist. Because, boy, if somebody calls you one, there's no defense to that. They might as well be accusing you of being a witch. And meanwhile, what percentage of the American population were actually Marxists? Like half of 1%? You've got to be kidding. The threat of a communist revolution from within in the United States of America has never been greater than zero. Please.
I am so glad you point that out, because that's exactly what it is this big exaggerated scare. You know, the Communist Party. I mean, my feeling is, look, I'm against communism, but I will fight for the right of communists to be communists. I think the Communist Party had a right to engage in the political process. People had a right to their views. That's what a free society is all about. It's the right to hold the wrong views. And this is what the right wing and the Pentagon and the CIA could never understand, that they cannot understand the picture of a free society where people hold diverse views. But there was never any real risk that the Communist Party was going to become the dominant party. But if it did, I mean, that's what sort of freedom's all about. I mean, that's what a democratic system's all about. You don't go kill people because they're holding these wrong views or because they're getting popularity. You stand there with your own views and you argue against them. And that's what we libertarians are doing. Now, notice the irony here. The irony during this entire time, you've got socialism coming into the United States with Social Security with Franklin Roosevelt, Medicare and Medicaid with Lyndon Johnson. The whole welfare state is really a variation of the socialist concept, public schooling. These are all core elements of the Cuban system, the North Korean system, national health care, public schooling. So you got socialism come into this thing while they're over there getting, you know, trying to trounce the communists. I mean, in a sense, maybe they're right that this socialist infection was taken over, but I mean, that's the risks of a democratic system.
Yeah. Hey, buddy, your IRS agent would be speaking Russian right now if it wasn't for the. But instead, they speak English, and so we're free. It's good.
Yeah. I mean, that's the attitude. I mean, the ideal, Scott, would have been after World War II. The ideal would have been to stay out of World War I, stay out of World War II. But the ideal would have been once the war was over, okay, we won, come home, discharge all the troops, declare victory, which there was 2 surrenders, Germany and Japan. Discharge all the soldiers, dismantle the Pentagon, don't ever bring in the NSA or the CIA, and restore a free society to our land. But when you look at this apparatus, which certainly should have gone out of existence at the end of the Cold War, it is the same apparatus that forms the foundation of this ridiculous war on terrorism, all the infringements on our freedoms, the power to round us up and assassinate us. I mean, all of this, torture, indefinite incarceration, all of this has its foundation in the national security apparatus that was formed at the end of World War II.
Yeah. And, you know, you referred earlier to the language in the National Security Act that sets the CIA free, if not the rest of us. And that it's so funny, and it's been a long time since I read it, so I bet I don't have it exactly right. But I believe the phrase in the document that you're referring to, it goes something like, and they shall also have the power to do other things from time to time, as directed by the president. Just something like that, other things. In other words, whatever the president says that they can do, they can do. And it's sort of like, to me, that phrase in regards to the CIA and that particular law is sort of symbolic of the entire thing, you know, like the war in Afghanistan. Grab whom you must, do what you want. There's no more rules anymore because communists, now it's terrorists, but whatever. It'll be the French or the Japanese next, whatever it is.
It was unlimited government. With that clause, the U.S. government became unlimited government. And that's why it's so funny to hear conservatives saying we favor limited government and the CIA. Because once you inserted that clause in there, that gave the CIA unlimited power. And secret power is unlimited power. And so how can you have a government that claims to be limited when you've got an agency with unlimited power, secret power? Contradiction
well,
in
we
terms.
see how they are. I mean, Obama, when he defended himself for negotiating on one issue, says, hey, look, I've bombed 7 countries. He meant 8. But that's how he proves that he's not a, Muslim imposter, traitor, usurper of John McCain's rightful throne here, turning the whole nation over to our, Persian nemesis enemies there. He says, hey, look, I kill Muslims all day, every day. I swear. You guys know that's true. Back me up on this. Right, Jim? Whatever.
Well, the important thing is, what do we do? And there's this obsession every 4 years of trying to get the right person in the presidency. This is nonsense. This is a systemic problem. It's a system problem that all you got to do is dismantle this whole apparatus. It should have gone out of existence during the Cold War. You look at Truman's op-ed that he wrote in the Washington Post 30 days after the Kennedy assassination, talking about how the CIA had become a sinister force in American life. If we dismantle this thing, and I would say dismantle the welfare state too, now you're talking about a free society once again. But as long as you keep this apparatus in existence, the American people should not be surprised when you've got all these refugees crises and violence and chaos and terrorism. I mean, it's just going to go on and on and on because of the existence of this apparatus. There's only one solution: dismantle it.
All right, and then I want to mention real quick Mike Swanson's book, The War State, which I know you've reviewed and endorsed, and he's written a couple things for the Future Freedom Foundation. And it's a really great history. Well, full disclosure, he sponsors my show, but that's not why I'm saying this. I only thought of that just now. What it is it's a history of the Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy years and the rise of the national security state, and how, of course, all 3 of those are responsible for it, but also, tried in their own way to limit it too. And it's a very interesting tale and very well told, The War State. And it's, just how they shifted our economy into this, basically permanent wartime posture, shifted our government to this national security state. And I think you'll really enjoy that. And what'd you say was the name of the new book you got coming out?
Yeah, well, let me first say Swanson's book is one of the best books I've ever read. I mean, if you don't read anything else about the Cold War and the rise of the national security state, read Swanson's book, The War State. It is absolutely fantastic. And then this new book about germ warfare in Korea is called This Must Be the Place by David Chaddock.
Oh, and you said you're publishing a new ebook on the national security state.
Yeah, we're publishing a new ebook that I wrote called The Evil of the National Security State, that essentially is an encapsulation of the things we're talking about tonight, that this is the foundation of the fundamental restructuring of America's governmental system and the perversion and warping of our principles and values, and how we need to start looking toward not reforming it, not knocking out a jet plane project here and there, not reining in the CIA or the NSA, a total dismantling of this apparatus and a restoration of the limited government republic that our framers intended for us. I mean, keep in mind, Scott, they did this fundamental realtering with no constitutional amendment at all. So,
all right, y'all. That is Jacob Hornberger. He's the founder and the president of the Future Freedom Foundation. Go over there, fff.org. Subscribe to the monthly journal. Read the daily email comes out with all kinds of at least a dozen great essays every morning. So sign up for that. It's fff.org/subscribe. And we will both see you guys back here next Thursday. Thanks very much for listening. Good night, Jacob. And good night, everybody.
Scott. Enjoyed it again as always.